God is the one that creates the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon are not gods that were created or had battle or had to establish their own rule. All right, so we've gone in reverse order up to this point. We've gone day 7. We're actually going to go in order for the next part of this. We're going to look at days 1 through 6 at this point. So I shouldn't say exactly in order, because when we look at the blueprint of days 1 through 6, we find something very unique. Days 1 and day 4 correlate. Days 2 and day 5 correlate. Days 3 and day 6 correlate. This is a literary style known as forward symmetry, it falling back on itself, this ABC pattern and then ABC repeated. And so this is the outline of where we're going. However, because this text is so beautifully inspired, within this forward symmetry style of writing, so within these 6 days are actually written in chiastic structure as well. And days 1 through 3 are written that way, and days 4 through 6 are written that way. And then even some of the days individually are written as that. So basically, there's a big picture, and then there's all these micro pictures and layers that go in, even down to the sentence level. And then we also see this because, or getting a little ahead of myself. So when we look at days 1 and day 4, and days 2 and day 5, that's when God essentially is working on the realm of the sky. And then days 3 and 6 is when he's working in the realm of the land. And then last week, we looked at the earth was without form and void. We looked those two Hebrew words, tohu vabohu, the unordered and the uninhabited. You'll see that days 1 through 3 up here, they actually deal with God bringing order to the unordered. And in days 4 through 6, he actually brings habitation, or things that will inhabit the uninhabited. But again, just because of this forward symmetry style and also the chiastic structure that is within it, and I didn't say this before, but if you're not familiar with chiastic structure, as opposed to forward symmetry, that's that ABC and then ABC again, chiastic is ABC, BA, so it reverses back on itself. But because of that being the grand structure of it, and this is something, I can't remember the scholar's name that pointed this out, but you can actually get, basically, you see these lines right here. This chapter or this section can actually fold all ways on itself, back on itself, because of the way that it's written. His name is David Andrew Teeter. He calls it literary origami. And he says that the days of Genesis 1 are arranged along 2 folds, a vertical axis that forms 2 matching triads, and a horizontal axis that forms each triad into a mirror shape. In other words, God didn't just, I'm going to ease you into this text. He starts out with the highest level possible of literary writing style when in his inspiration, giving it to the authors. So we're actually going to get into day 1 here in just a second, but this is just a recap. Again, last week we looked at that. Now the land was wild and waste. Darkness was over the face, and darkness was over the face of the deep abyss. In days 1, 2, and 3, each one of these issues is brought from a state of chaos and unorderliness to a state of order and control. And we will start really here, or we'll remain in that state of chaos really quick. And this is where we get into that term polemic that we looked at earlier. So this is where you get, and God said, then and God made. What I want to point out here, this picture right here is the Egyptian worldview. You can see how it kind of mirrors, here's one slide ahead, how it kind of mirrors that same cosmologic view, or view of cosmology rather. But what's interesting is that in the Egyptian account, the difference between the 2 accounts, the grand difference between the Genesis account, and there's 4 different Egyptian creation views, but specifically to one of them, the difference lies in the fact that God employs both means of creation without the aid of another God. Because in the Egyptian view, basically every element in nature was a deity. And specifically when we look at that formless and emptiness from the opening lines of Genesis, there are 4 pairs of gods. It's a male and a female, and they're husband and wife in the Egyptian view. But they make up the empty formlessness, the darkness, the watery deep, and the air and the wind, this hidden element. We see all of those elements within the Genesis 1 through 3 account, how it was empty and formless. There was darkness over the deep chaos waters, and then the Spirit of God is there hovering in control. And so, again, when we look at this as potentially being religious polemic, what's the deal here? It's that Yahweh is actually the one in control. He doesn't need the help of other deities, and there are no other deities but him. He is the all-powerful, infinite creator. And again, looking at this picture, Egyptian cosmology, and I'm spending a little bit of time on it just so you know going into days, the days 1 through 6, that Egyptian theology really dealt with this concept known as theogony, which is just a fancy term that means the account of the origin and the descent of the gods. So think of a family tree or a genealogy tree of the gods. Their creation narratives all revolved around where did our gods come from? Whereas Genesis rejects that entirely, that polytheistic view of every element as another god. The view, obviously, of the Bible is that Yahweh, the God of Israel, he is the one that created the cosmos. But gave birth to no other gods, nor did he generate himself. In the Egyptian view, their gods all came from somewhere. They were generated really from this kind of chaotic state. But again, for the biblical worldview, God was the one that created from the very beginning, whenever that might have been. And unlike the Egyptian creation myths, again, the Bible never attempts to explain where God came from. He's just always been there. He always was there, and he always will be there. All right, so let's actually get into days 1 through 4 right now. I know that was a big overview, but it's important. I wanted you to get a little bit of the Egyptian view going into days 1 through 4 because it plays in, or days 1 and day 4. So again, day 1 opens, there's that separation, let there be light. And so God separates the light from darkness. This is the realm of the sky. Then that correlating act on day 4, when we looked at the forward symmetry, is that God places the hosts of the sky that will inhabit the sky, namely the sun, the moon, and the stars. And they are called actually to have dominion, like spoiler alert, the humans are to have dominion on the earth. But this is where, the hosts in the sky are placed. And I do want to point out, this is something that we mentioned before we got started tonight. Robert talked on it a little bit, that the sun, the light in day 1 wouldn't have been the light from the sun because the sun wasn't created until day 4. So this is actually God's divine light coming and invading that chaotic darkness, if you will, or invading or establishing control over from the time he started creating. So again, let there be light. This is just Genesis 1:3, and God said, let there be light. We talked a little bit about that let there be, and it was so pattern. But we also see in this creation of light on day 1, going back to that polemic view that we talked about, actually may show, and this is the view of some scholars, but that this creation of light and the luminaries, the sun, the moon, and the stars, on day 4 are a polemic against Adam-Ra, or Ra, the main Egyptian, the sun god of Egypt. Because this shows that the source of light does not originate with the sun or the moon, but with the Hebrew God who is distinct from the light in creation itself. So again, the gods of Egypt need help. They came into existence where Yahweh always was in existence. And then this right here, this is that chiastic structure a little bit that I had mentioned. This is an example of it, but this is actually from day 4 when God creates the lights and places them in the sky. So you can see how initially God says, let there be lights for dividing between the day and the night, and let them be for appointed times, for feast days and festivals. Let them give light on the land. And so God makes, in this translation, I actually like it, it says the 2 lamps, because it's actually this idea of a luminary. But for one, have you 2 lamps, 2 lights. The sun is for ruling the day, the greater for ruling the day, and the little lamp for ruling the night. And then it falls back on itself, and he set them in the dome of the skies to give light upon the land and to rule. Again, there's that idea of ruling the day and the night, and to divide the light between the darkness. So you can see how a theme was established, like God has the intention, or he says, let there be for this purpose, and then that purpose is accomplished through this structure. And this structure is training you to see that. And again, just to hit on this one more time, I really like this quote and how it's put. This quote is from a very large book. It's called the Dictionary of Deities and Demons within the Bible. And it basically lists every single god of every single religion that is referenced in the Bible, whether that be for polemic or that this specific group, the Canaanites worshipped this god and that god. The author of this book goes through 3 groups of deities, and this is what he says about the third group. He says, the Bible, there's a third group of deities, or of deities consists of gods mentioned in the Bible, but not in their capacity as gods. They are the so-called demythologized deities. And so he talks about the sun and the moon being an example of this, to where, again, God is the one that creates the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon are not gods that were created or had battle or had to establish their own rule. And the reason this is important is because, and we see this in our language too, there's a lot of Hebrew words like sun and moon that are used that are actually, because they share a common language from that time period, that it actually reflects the names of those gods of the sun and the moon. But it doesn't, what I'm getting at here is that it doesn't mean that the Hebrews or God's people or God himself viewed these things as deities. It was simply that God was the one that had created them. All right, so let's look at day 2 and day 5, now that we've gone through day 1 and day 4. So the act of unorderliness on day 2 is, or the act of order rather, is when God separates the waters below from the waters above. And then on day 5, God places creatures to inhabit both the sky and the water. He puts birds in the sky and he puts the sea creatures in the water below. And again, this ends with, and there was evening and morning, the 2nd and the 5th day. We're going to look at this a little bit, and this is actually my favorite polemic, if you will, within the opening chapters. But we looked at this concept last week of the deep, how in chapter 1, verse 2, that darkness was over the face of the deep, but the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and how the deep was a chaotic and dark ocean. And we asked the question last week, when were the waters created? And answered that or left it open-ended with, rather than being created at some point, they're already presupposed, because that's the pre-existing material. But here's what's really cool about this. And this is something that scholars have recognized. Not everyone's in agreement on this. There's discussion around it, but it's well worth mentioning. There are some scholars that believe the Hebrew word tahom, which is the word deep, is actually correlated with the Babylonian sea goddess or chaos goddess Tiamat from the Babylonian creation narrative. Tiamat is thought to be, or is conceptualized by the sea and also a sea monster. However, in order to establish order, whereas God spoke everything and was in control, in their version of the story, the god Marduk, who is actually mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, I believe, actually defeats Tiamat. And what he does is, after he beats her, this giant sea serpent, he slices her body in half, and from the bottom he makes the land, and from the top of her he makes the sky. And so when the Bible talks about God separating the waters from the waters, there's this thought that perhaps it's a polemic against, whereas Marduk had to do this great battle because he's not an all-powerful, infinite being, that God is just hovering over the chaotic waters, and God just says, and it's not personified as a sea monster, it's just something that God had already created, that God just said, hey, separate, because I'm forming a realm for habitation. And when we actually look at this is verses 6 through 8, this is what God says. He says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under from those that were above. And he called the expanse heaven. And really what I want to get at here is that idea that, again, some will view this picture as that ancient, or in this case, the biblical cosmology view. And this is not that it's God's view necessarily, it's the view that the people, the audience had at the time that the Bible was written. But you have this word expanse right here, which is the Hebrew word rakia. And this is a word, there is so much discussion around this topic about what is the rakia, I think, because there's another word that can be translated as sky too. But all I'm getting at here is that there are some that would point to the idea that the firmament mentioned here, which you can see outlined right here, is perceived of as a solid dome or a hard sky, in reference to how the biblical audience would have viewed the world at the time. And so again, God meeting them in that worldview. And you get passages throughout the Bible, like we looked at, and this is one of the passages that Jeremy had mentioned previously, that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the rakia above proclaims his handiwork. So that there's this idea that they are two separate entities. And there's other passages from Proverbs and Job that actually talks about the skies being firm or hard as cast metal. And I say all this just to let you know the kind of two competing views here that there is one that, and I'll just get to it right here. There's objecting views going on, and you'll particularly hear this when we looked at those 7 views at the beginning. You see the discussion on how should we interpret Genesis. Should we do it through a modern kind of scientific view, or should we do it going back to the literary style of the day? And really what it comes down to is there's so much controversy, if you will, and discussion around this word rakia, or firmament. And the main reason is that the word does not, and this is a quote I got, but the main objection for it being used is that the word does not suit the modern scientific understanding of the atmosphere and space. However, as some would point out, that should actually be seen as an advantage because Genesis 1 was not written from the viewpoint of a modern astronomer, if you will. And so I tell you this not to tell you which way to think. I'm telling you to let you know that you will hear arguments on both sides of this, and just more or less to be well informed as you see these come up. Again, there's also this idea that there's polemic against another story from the ancient Near East in this, and that is from the Baal cycle. Baal is probably the god most mentioned in the Bible because he's the god of a lot of rivaling neighbors to Israel. But we look in Psalm 74, which we don't normally think of as creation, but Psalm 74 is a creation narrative because it goes back to when God, in verse 13, divided the sea, when he broke the head of the sea monsters on the water, and he crushed the heads of Leviathan. And all 3 of these words, sea monsters, and Leviathan, correlate directly to the Ugaritic gods of their creation narrative. And so again, there's this idea that hey, it's not your gods that established order. It's Yahweh that did it. And you're telling the story this way, but I'm here to tell you that it's our God. It's Yahweh, the all-powerful, infinite being that did it. And so that's days 2 and day 5, day 2 and day 5. Let's look at days 3 and day 6, and this is where it gets really, really good. In day 3 and day 6, you'll notice that rather than there being one creative act on each day, there's now 2. There's a bonus act. What is brought into order on day 3 is we have the dry land emerge, and then we have the vegetative plants, the seeds, the fruit trees that make fruit. And then on day 6, we have the land creatures, and then we have the humans. And there's some Egyptian polemic around this, but I won't really get into it too deeply. What I really want to focus in on is the bonus creative act of day 3 and day 6. So again, dry land emerges, and then from that land, God creates the land creatures. What's interesting to note here on day 3 and day 6, the bonus act is correlating humans to fruit trees. And so right away, this is the author of this narrative letting you know that when you see trees throughout the Bible, you are to think of human beings too. And you're to see them functioning in kind of a synonymous role, or at least relating to one another. And we'll look at, again, a couple passages where we see this. Where does the fall happen? At the tree of knowing good and bad. And we'll get into a little bit why I have it as bad. But either way, you have Moses at the burning bush. The book of Proverbs calls Lady Wisdom and the righteous trees of life. And then how about when Jesus heals in the New Testament? He heals a blind man, and he says, I see people, but they look like trees. There's the reference to the vine and the branches, and also the cross as the tree that Jesus was nailed to. But perhaps the most interesting example is when in Jeremiah we see that Israel was called a green olive tree that that Yahweh planted. And when we look at Romans 11:17, when Paul is speaking to people of the nations who want to be grafted in to the family of God, he talks about them in reference to being a wild olive shoot that is grafted in to the olive tree. And so you have this correlation between, again, people and trees. And then in Psalm 1, it talks about the man who is blessed. Blessed is man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, whose delight is in the law of the Lord. He is like a tree that is planted by streams of water that yields fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. So again, this kind of correlates again to Jesus' message. We are called to bear fruit as believers, the fruit of the gospel. Moving ahead from the trees, or not moving ahead, but more to humans being made in the image of God. This is actually verse 27 in Genesis 1 is the first poem in the Bible. which is very cool. But this gets really interesting right here. It says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the discussion prior to this, but that word man right there is the word ha-adam, the Adam. In other words, Adam is the word for man or humanity in Hebrew. And because it has that ha, which is the word the, essentially, in front of it, it actually cannot be a proper name. And so this is more or less a reference to God creating humanity. And the him that you see here is because Hebrew, well, every language essentially except English is language based on words having a gender. That word man is masculine, and so the him here, which actually refers to all of humanity, is actually a reference to humanity as a whole, not him as in an individual man. And then it talks about how God creates male and female right here. And so also to be created in the image of God, what does this really mean? Because God is spirit. And so we tend to think physical appearance, well, what does God look like? But spiritual beings don't have physical bodies. And this is where it gets really interesting right here, because the Hebrew word used of image in the text here actually refers to statues or idols elsewhere in the Bible, at least on some occasions. And then we look at the second commandment, God says not to create idols after anything. And why is this such a big deal to God? And I believe, and many have pointed this out again, it's because God has already created quote-unquote idols. He's created humanity that, unlike wooden, non-living idols, they are living idols with the breath of God that are called to be fruitful and multiply on his behalf. We don't create idols because you and I are the idols of the Creator. And again, be fruitful and multiply. Just as the trees have seed to be fruitful and multiply, so we are called as humans to be fruitful and multiply, which we've looked at. That could mean procreation, fill the earth, but it could also mean, and what we've looked at before, the idea of the Great Commission, commissioning people into God's family. And so that's where we'll cap the Genesis 1 narrative.